I want to welcome you to this series of lectures on Planet Under Stress, organized by Dr. Patricia Gallagher and Laurie Wood from SFU's Center for Coastal Science and Management. We are particularly fortunate to have as our speaker this evening Dr. David Schindler, Killam Memorial Professor of Ecology at the University of Alberta. His distinguished research record in limnology, ecology, aquatic ecosystem science has been recognized, of course, nationally and internationally by an absolutely astounding number of honors and awards, such as, at a minimum, 10 honorary degrees, Fellow of the Royal Society, Officer of the Order of Canada, just to name a few, and as a Sanford Fleming Medal Award winner. And I quote, "to a scientist who is able to bridge the gap between the lab and the people." This last accolade, I believe, is especially important one if you are properly to understand the cumulative impact and significance of his research for Canadian society. And just let me elaborate very briefly on this. In many ways, Dr. Schindler is what I would refer to as a scientific sleuth, with a wonderful ability to identify smoking guns when it comes to identifying complex cause and effect relationships in aquatic ecosystems. But his work extends further and much deeper than this. Arguably, he has made and continues to make important contributions to what I would call action science, where the best of evidence-based scientific research is used to promote environmental amelioration and mitigation strategies through public action. Among his most noteworthy accomplishments is the leadership role he played in 1968 as a Canadian federal research scientist in what was termed at the time in the large-scale whole lakes experiments. He and his colleagues clearly identified the role of phosphorus in freshwater lake eutrophication. Policy change soon followed in banning the release of high phosphate detergents and the use of phosphorus in sewage treatment plants in the Great Lakes Basin. Other examples of this penchant for action science include identifying the clear link between cold fire plants and acid rain, for which he received the Order of Canada in 2004. More recently, he has been a firm critic of the destruction of the Canadian boreal forest, arguing, and I would certainly agree with this, that the value of carbon storage in the boreal forest is worth many times more than what we get back from boreal industries. And within the context of the growing scarcity of water in the prairies, he has warned about the environmental impact of a rapidly expanding agricultural sector as climate change alters the basic parameters for sustainability. And his work on the contamination of surface waters, notably in the Athabasca water from the oil sands development, and its impact on fish habitat and health have forced action on the need for better monitoring. Throughout his career, then, his scientific endeavors have been matched by a very strong and responsible environmental ethic. Perhaps not surprisingly, Dr. Schindler has been critical of academic ivory tower scientists who failed to connect their research findings more directly to public action and solutions. Clearly, he sets a very high bar to emulate, but nevertheless an important one if publicly funded science is to address the long-term effects and consequences of anthropogenic sources of environmental change. Let me conclude with two very brief observations. One is that in high school, and correct me if I have this wrong, David, in Minnesota, Dr. Schindler was dissuaded from studying biology in university because his teachers saw no value in it and no future. No future. He went on to do engineering, but it was that link, specifically through physics, that led him to work as a field assistant in limnology that eventually led him to study as a Rhodes Scholar for his PhD in Oxford with Charles Elton, one of the foremost ecologists of the day. And we should also be appreciative and thankful that as an American, Dr. Schindler decided to choose Canada to both live and work in a most creative and beneficial way. Please welcome Dr. David Schindler.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. I know there are competing hockey games and things like that. I'm going to talk about the oil sands, but it's going to be kind of a light talk, mostly color slides and things. You've already seen the most technical part of this evening's presentation and how to operate your chairs. Well, this picture I have up is the first oil sands plant, first called Great Canadian Oil Sands and later Suncor, and it shows some of the problems. This is the Athabasca River, and these are some huge tailings ponds. To get an idea of scale, that dike is 100 meters high, so it gives you an idea of what you're looking at. The more recent ones aren't that close to the river, but there are now 131 square meters of those things, some of them up to 100 meters deep. So they're not ponds anymore. It's more like a toxic Great Lake. And the technology of how to process tailings from bitumen without creating those seems to be eluding the companies. There we go. This is the Athabasca River. As you can see from the small panel on the left side, it crosses Alberta diagonally, starting in the headwaters in the Rockies, and then it turns north right at Fort McMurray, which used to be a sleepy little trapping town when I started working there in the 1970s. Flows straight north to the Peace Athabasca Delta, where it flows into Lake Athabasca along with the Peace River. And it's such a lush delta that there are about 3,000 native people there, and they've lived there for thousands of years. The size of the area of Alberta that can be exploited for oil sands is huge. Doesn't look much on an Alberta map. And I'll be talking mostly about this small pink area, which is the area that they can surface mine. But the new greenwash is, we're not going to do that kind of damage to the rest out in this red area. I'll show you some slides toward the end to illustrate what they have in mind for that. But the oil sands are roughly the size of the country of Greece, and given the state of Greece in the EU right now, maybe we could make them a trade. I think it would be a pretty good trade. We hear a lot of fuss about the Sydney tar ponds, and many of the contaminants of concern are the same there as in the oil sands. This is the size of the Sydney tar ponds that we've turned away from reclaiming several times because of the high cost, which should give you some perspective on what's going to happen. Well, the last few years, there's been rather shameless promotion of the oil sands. Alberta Environment's budget for ecology on the Athabasca River was $300,000 last year, but their propaganda budget for promotions was $25 million. So it gives you an idea of what's going on, and the sorts of things that are being said are illustrated on this slide, one of our former premier's talks, and it sounds like the current premier is going to continue with this sort of promotion. The result of that has been an exponential increase in development. We're here right now, and all of these arrows over on the right side are other developments that have already been approved. So Fort McMurray has grown from 7,000 to where now it's about 77,000. And in addition, there are about 50,000 people in work camps by their best estimates. They'd estimated there was 30,000, and When they actually did a census, they found about 45, and they weren't sure they got them all. So the true number in those camps is probably around 50,000 people. Well, 7.5% a year is what that works out to as an exponential. That's a doubling time of every 10 years if you use a compound formula. That's twice the rate of development of any sane development. Infrastructure just can't keep up, which is why there are buildings falling down and roads can't handle the traffic and hospitals can't accommodate the people. So it's a pretty strange sort of development going on. And the spin is that Canadians make a lot of money from the oil sands. But this is a report that was released last week, figures through 2010 by the Parkland Institute at the University of Alberta. And you can see here the overall profits in the oil sands the last few years have been in the $30 to $40 billion a year range. The blue and the green down here are what Canadians get out of that. So it's the order of less than 10% of the overall profits. All of this red area is going to companies. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. The reason for that, and this is also from the same report, is that over the lifetime of the tar sands, the royalties, the proportion that Albertans get, has gone down, down, down. In Peter Lougheed's day, we were getting around 30 and as high as 40% at that peak. They were reduced under Don Getty, a bit more under Ralph Klein, and they took a big dive under Ed Stelmach. So you wonder what's next. So right now we're getting about 12% of the profits being made there. So you see strange equations like we hear talk about all these riches, but we're told the Alberta budget is $6 billion in the red, and yet every time you pick up a paper, there's another company reporting a quarterly profit on the order of $2 billion. Something is wrong with this picture. This is the Parkland Institute's take on it, that no wonder all these companies want to get in on the oil sands. It's a really good deal. They're tripping all over themselves to get in on the action. And we're told that cumulative effects assessment is being done, but I can't see it. You could fly a plane load of village idiots, hand-picked for low IQ around the world, over this area and ask them, do you see any cumulative impact? I think they'd all say yes. So by continuing to tell us this, they must think we've all just fallen off a turnip truck, as this fellow at the bottom of the panel. So this is my copy of the slide that the Premier showed. We have a lot of catching up to do in the oil sands. And I'll talk only about a few of these things tonight. Reclamation and water pollution, and some of the other issues related to water and boreal destruction. We also hear a lot about this ethical oil, how we have to buy Canadian oil rather than this nasty oil from countries where they mistreat their women. Somehow I don't think it's any worse to mistreat a woman than it is to mistreat both sexes of all the Aboriginal people. And exporting 70% of the take to the U.S. when our own eastern coast has to rely on those same unethical sources of oil. Meanwhile, if you're under 40, you're going to pay for this development, as I'll show you later. The scheme is clearly that the profit will be made by my generation. We're going to scram out of here and be pushing up daisies when time comes to pay the bill. Now, I'll show you some figures that illustrate that clearly later on. And is it ethical to rely on propaganda to sell the oil sands to Canadians and to people offshore, rather than putting it into some environmental science? This is one of the people now who's branded any green groups, and by insinuation, anybody who would dare say anything against the oil sands is radical extremists. So I guess I'm a radical extremist. And we have a whole cabinet full of these folks right now. I don't think these green groups deserve a lot of credit for what's happening in the oil sands. The voices that I listen to are Peter Lougheed, the guy who started the oil sands, who about 3-4 times a year is quoted as saying the oil sands development should slow down. Or people like our former environment minister, Jim Prentice, who says that the Keystone Pipeline shows a need to improve its record after several oil spills were revealed. Those are the folks that I think people listen to, not Greenpeace, or they listen to companies. And companies are not doing themselves any favor. Can you imagine Greenpeace, with all its foreign funding, getting the kind of press that having 1,600 oil ducks on the front page of every newspaper around the globe for a year did, along with some absurd proclamation by some high-powered lawyer that it was the ducks' fault? This is what Syncrude chose to do to itself, rather than quietly paying a fine and getting out of the press. So we don't need green groups with the kind of antics we see from our politicians and companies in the oil sands. They're doing a fine job of giving themselves a black eye. Well, the focus of a lot of attention has been the alleged increased cancer rates in Fort Chipewyan. I started hearing about those in the 1990s. I've worked up there off and on since the 70s, and it was rumored that more and more people were dying of cancer. By the 1990s, the evidence was strong enough that the Northern River Basin study, which had a number of eminent scientists and a number of eminent citizens on it, recommended that it was time to do a detailed health study. But nobody did. The government just deep-sixed the report. And then early in this decade, the local physician up there sounded the alarm that he thought there were a high number. And he was, of course, stripped of his practice and heavily discounted and moved to Newfoundland for a period. Luckily, he was exonerated in the end and he was back. But the first detailed study that was done was by the Alberta Cancer Board just 3 years ago, and they did indeed find a higher rate of cancers. Not a lot higher. It's possible that the number is due to chance, but again, they recommended a health study because it was close enough, it was high enough on the end of probability that there was reason for some concern. But the government's position in Alberta has been, well, it can't be caused by the oil sands because nothing from the oil sands gets into the river. We have it all totally blocked. And if you were to believe them, all of the pollutants in the river would be coming from little seeps like this. And there are lots of these in the banks of the Athabasca and its tributaries. They were places that Aboriginal people used to stop and tar their leaky birch bark canoes. But that would also mean that there was nothing coming out of the atmosphere. Yet there are two big upgraders up there that burn coke and smelt bitumen, which has a periodic table full of contaminants, many of them toxic. And the reason I thought that was of concern is that 30 years ago I chaired a panel for the U.S. National Academy, which looked at this problem worldwide, and we did not find a single source of fossil fuel burning or ore smelting that did not discharge a host of contaminants to the atmosphere, toxic trace metals and organic compounds, and they fall back into the biosphere at various distances from the source, depending on their properties. So, and some other things, nothing's getting into the river, but the same companies saying that are reporting to the National Pollutant Research or Release Inventory that their output from those same stacks has tripled in 8 years. All you have to do to check up on this company now, thanks to EcoJustice and a few environmental groups, is Google on the letters NPRI, and you'll get this huge spreadsheet of the periodic table versus your favorite companies, and you can see over time how much they've been putting out. So somehow the companies were reporting they were putting this out, but it's mysteriously disappearing. And also, if you believe that it's all those little seeps, that means that developments like this is the Athabasca River at the bottom, are yielding nothing to the river. And for somebody who's worked on watersheds for 40 years, Watershed Science 101 is that you strip the soils and vegetation, expose the underlying fresh geology, put rain and snow on it, and the runoff magically increases in any elements that are in that fresh geologic substrate. That had to be what was happening. This little orange barrier is like the things that you see in road ditches when they're scooping out the ditches. And this is the Athabasca. There's a lot more of this going on in the tributaries that are mined. In some cases, they're scooping the tributaries right out. Another warning sign, this regional aquatic monitoring program that's industry sponsored has been doing the monitoring since 1997. This doesn't show up too well. I chose the wrong color, but this quote is, I think, pretty telling. This was a 2004 review. There's no overall regional plan. There are clear questions that weren't being addressed, significant shortfalls with respect to statistical design, on and on and on. That was a warning sign for me a few years ago, yet that report was never made public until Andrew Nikiforuk found it and put it on the web and made it visible via his book. But RAMP was reviewed a second time during this past year when we had half the scientists in Canada, it seemed, doing panels. This is the URL if you want to look at it. They found that RAMP had fulfilled one of its 7 objectives. They had found in this 2004 review that it had fulfilled none of its 7 objectives. But the one it had fulfilled was to get itself re-reviewed. So other than that, it was the same report, just as scathing as the 2004 report. Another warning sign is this group of stars represents the provincial monitoring plan. When they found that RAMP was not doing such a great job on organic pollutants, they decided to monitor them. This is their $300,000 program. The 5-sided stars are on the Athabasca, and the 4-sided ones are on tributaries. How you can separate the effects of industry and natural sources by having one site at the mouth of a tributary is beyond me. I haven't figured that one out in 50 years of doing science. So to me, that was another warning sign. So with all of the things I just showed you, I had lunch with the minister in 2007, and he just waved all those arguments away. And we have 4 million data points on the river. It's the most comprehensive monitoring program anywhere in the world. Everything's under control. So 3 of us decided we'd do our own study. The 3 of us, Jeff Short, who's a scientist with the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, And Peter Hodson, who's a toxicologist at Queen's, and I met because we were hired by the Alberta government as experts to help design the program for Lake Wabamun after Canadian National Railway spilled 7 cars of bunker C into the lake. And in comparing the contaminants and the effects, our conversation turned to the Exxon Valdez, which Jeff had been studying for 20 years, and the oil sands, where Peter had done a lot of toxicology and produced several PhD students. So we got some money from the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation and the Tides Foundation, and hired Erin Kelly, who'd done her PhD with me a few years before on mercury, to do our own field study. And we chose to do several sites on the tributaries and more on the Athabasca, as represented by all of these arrows. The first thing we did was to do a GIS map showing where the bitumen deposits were, the white areas on that graph. And we carefully sampled upstream of those in the area with the bitumen, but where there was no industry, and then downstream of industry on each tributary. The red circle on there is the distance to which we found detectable airborne contaminants coming out of those stacks in our snow sampling. So this is one example. The muskeg is one of the mined rivers, and the green area here in our upper site are upstream of any oil bearing bitumen. MU2 is in the bitumen area but upstream of industry, and MU3 is below the industrial development shown in pink here. And we studied 2 groups of chemicals. One were polycyclic aromatics, which were the things that after the Exxon Valdez caused the long-term damage. They were suppressing reproduction in sea otters and in some of the sea ducks up to 20 years after that spill. And these are just 3 examples. There are hundreds of these. Some of them variations with a little bit of sulfur in them called dibenzothiophenes, and some with a straight chain carbon chain hanging off one of the corners known as alkylated PAHs. For the Exxon, Jeff and his colleagues had developed a very clever technique. Instead of having to extract a huge water sample, they took these little metal containers. They're just 4-inch aluminum pipe cut into segments with some pegs on one side that they can wind a special polyethylene membrane on. The membrane collects these polycyclic aromatics. They come to equilibrium in about a month, and then you can pull them out and extract the membrane and get a pretty good estimate of the polycyclic aromatics. And they'd done extensive calibrations of these. This, remember, was 2008. It was in the Bush era, so they had a whole room full of these things that they weren't using since they had no money to deploy them. So we just borrowed them for a year. And we also borrowed one of their senior technicians and got her to the U of A, and we ran their samples and they ran ours until we were getting comparable results for the polycyclic aromatics. We also sampled toxic trace metals. The 13 we have written up so far were the ones on the US EPA's list of priority pollutants. And in this case, we had the laboratories at Queen's University, which are certified for trace metals, do the analyses, so there would be no argument about them. Remember that this river is under ice for 5 months of the year or more. This is a shot taken actually in April of 2005. It's covered with snow, as is the surrounding terrain. So air pollutants can accumulate on this for the whole winter time. And then in classic acid rain fashion, just what you see all over the east, or in Scandinavia, that polluted snowpack melts in a few weeks and dumps into the river. So this is what the snowpack looks like. Flying over it, you can actually see that the snowpack is gray for several kilometers in all directions, and we could detect contaminants out to 50 kilometers. You can see the black layers in this snow. What we did was to take snow cores at each of the sites that we sampled, melt them down and then filter them. These were white filters when we started. These are with 900 milliliters of snow water each. And to orient you, this is the upstream end with Fort McMurray out here, going downstream to Fort Chippewa. The yellow numbers are in kilometers between sampling sites. These little sidebars are the 3 sites on each of the tributaries coming in. The blue are places that people live, or Bitumen Mount is the first laboratory that quit operating in the 50s up there, where a lot of the original bitumen research was done, and the red are companies. So all of this is a grid that's 226 by 74 kilometers, and the black on these filters is particulate contamination. And AR6, this site, is where the 2 upgraders are across the river from one another. After filtering, this is what the snow water looked like. This is from a remote site. In the impacted area near the smelter, there was actually a pretty thick layer of oil on top of the snow water. And turns out that there was more polycyclic aromatic in the particulates there by a factor of 8 than in the richest ore in that area. So when industry tried to explain the results away by claiming it was blowing dust, it was kind of embarrassing for them. I hope they fired the consultant who did that work for them, because they're not mining anything as rich as this. What's happening is these things are going up that stack at a temperature of about 500 Celsius, hits that minus 30 degree atmosphere, and they condense back, fall to the snow, and then these things are all hydrophobic, so they cling to any organic particle they can find. This is why the particles get so contaminated. So when we plotted these results up, I'm just going to show you a few of them, or we'd be here all evening. This is the sort of profile that we found, an exponential fall away from those upgrader stacks. And this red line indicates the 50 kilometer point. We could hardly detect anything out beyond that. And if you plot them, this is from upriver, Fort McMurray, end to downriver at Fort Chip. If you plot them going downriver, on each bar, the black is what's on the particulates, and the red is what's on the in dissolved form. You can see this bullseye that points right at the site of the 2 upgraders, AR6. And on the tributaries, a general tendency to increase as you're getting closer as well. It was much the same pattern for polycyclic aromatics, for mercury, a little bit of distortion in mercury. Arsenic, I'm just going to show you a few that are of particular concern up there. Vanadium, which we're told is a sure indicator that it's oil sands because they're very high in vanadium. Concentrations are low, but they're much higher than the background. So the statement that nothing from industry is getting into the river was simply incorrect. And if you compare the snowpack within that 50 kilometer radius shown by the dark bars here with that from outside that area, more remote area shown in white bars, you can see in every case the average concentration is much higher. And this just gives you an idea of the tributaries, much the same pattern, so I won't go into it in detail. This is coming downriver from outside the bitumen area. This is what is coming in from natural sources, and this is what's coming in from industry. And on these, the black are winter samples. You can see they're not increasing very much because a lot of the airborne stuff is being intercepted by the ice and snow. In summer, you can see it's quite a different story, the gray bars here. And the bottom panels are the same thing, going from upstream at the bottom to downstream at the top. And again, you can see the peaks point right at the main industrial development. So we published this stuff up, chose to put it in high quality journals, and I sent copies to the federal and provincial minister just before they were released. I thought they were pretty mild conclusions. There was nothing that was over consumption guidelines, though there are no guidelines for polycyclic aromatics, and there are no guidelines really for pollutant soups. The guidelines we have are for individual metals, and no one really knows what 8 or 10 toxic metals in combination, or in combination with polycyclic aromatics, has in the way of toxicity, except that a few things are starting to emerge. If you combine polycyclics with arsenic, they're much more toxic than they are on their own. And the same is known about some of the trace metals in combination. But still, they were pretty mild results. But what they did show was that the statement that all of these pollutants were natural was not true, pretty well stripping away the excuse not to do a health study, and also that these were in violation of the Fisheries Act, which is very clear-cut. No deleterious substances will be deposited in or near a fish-bearing stream. Here it is, and that's today's Fisheries Act. We'll see if it's the same after tomorrow. As you probably read in the papers, there's the threat that the habitat provisions of this act will be removed. So the ministers at both levels denounced our report. But a couple of people had second thoughts. The first one was our premier, Ed Stelmach, who a couple of days after this denouncement said, gee, I can remember a couple of cases where Schindler was right. Maybe we should have some other people look at this paper. So I immediately emailed him and said, what a great idea. Here's a list of people who are members of the Royal Society with unrefutable credentials. There were a couple of petroleum geologists and a lot of ecologists on the list. Well, he didn't respond right away, but the next day, Jim Prentice phoned me up personally from Ottawa and said, I've gotten some advice that I ought to look at your work. If I fly to Edmonton tonight, will you show it to me? So I said, sure. I met him at the airport along with Aaron Kelly, my postdoc, and we sat in a little room and went through the slides. And it was obvious that he got what was going on very quickly. And he said, well, what do you think I should do? So I gave him the same suggestion. He had a panel by the time he got back in Ottawa, I think. Got hold of these people right away. Stelmach handed putting together the panel off to his Minister of Environment. And it took them a little longer, largely because they had to come up with new names. You would have thought they could combine and have one panel, but they each had to have a panel. And in the course of a little over 1 year, we actually had 6 panels viewing our results versus the monitoring that had been going on, or in the case of RAMP, just the RAMP review. I mentioned that one earlier. And the Auditor General got in on the act with his own review, and the Royal Society had their own review. So 6 panels out of 6 agreed with us that the monitoring needed improving. Some of the things were pretty conspicuous. Like this is our lowest sample. This is below the ice in winter. And these little bars are individual congeners of these polycyclic aromatics. This was RAMP's detection limit. So they were being truthful when they said they couldn't see anything getting into the river. Their methods weren't good enough to detect it. And this is one of our highest samples, showing much the same thing. Again, this is their limit of detection. Whoops, I don't know why that arrow is slipped. It's supposed to be pointing to that red line. But you can see they would only have seen the bars that protrude through that red line. So if you did the sums on them, we came up with a total of 700, and they came up with a total of half that. So the threshold for toxicity is about 400. So they were detecting amounts that were not worrisome. The provincial panel was not very kind to the provincial monitoring program, which I found pretty satisfying. It appears that the laboratories that Alberta Environment used do not have the capability of measuring low concentration. So the message here is a really clear one. If you want to be able to say that you're not putting in the river, get the most incompetent monitoring program and tell them to hire the most incompetent chemical laboratory they can, and presto, you're home free. And the minister had reported to, kept referring to this report of his and this great monitoring program that had 4 million data points, and this report that was done on it showed that there were no trends. Well, the provincial panel had some other things to say. Limitations in quantity and accuracy made it difficult for the author to apply trends, which the author actually said. So it was the minister's interpretation that these showed that nothing was going on. And in contrast, they said that our studies were useful in exposing what had been going on. Of course, all of that was followed by the papers with great glee. The most recent one by the Edmonton Journal demanded that the government apologize to me, but of course that never happened. So there's a number of logical next steps that I am hoping will be taken. The minister, in desperation, put together a last program. That was to develop a world-class monitoring system. They reported in July that the program would have to be run independently, not by either level of government, because people had lost trust in both levels of government. And while the minister swore that he would act immediately on it, we're still waiting. Finally, last week, they announced yet another panel to tell them how this panel ought to be put together and how it ought to report. And they're supposed to report in June. But the principals on that panel are the same ones who are on the world-class monitoring panel. They're business people who are big Tory party supporters. And they've been getting pretty cranky, accusing the government of wasting their time for 6 months on this monitoring panel. So suddenly they're hearing the same thing from some of their biggest party supporters that they're hearing from people like me. And they don't know where to turn. They've got no allies at this point. So I think something might happen. And I think there's good competence, at least at the federal level, to do the monitoring as long as the scientists aren't muzzled. And we've all heard that story. But we need a good monitoring program, and we need to know if the people are getting levels of contaminants, probably through their food. I don't think it's water or direct exposure, but we'll see if the study's ever done. Hopefully it will at least give people some comfort. Now they've changed their tune. They're saying, oh, well, that's just the mined area. That's just a small part of the area. It's only 475,000 hectares. The rest of the area will be done with these in situ methods, which they call SAGD, for steam-assisted gravity something or another. They pump steam down one pipe, turn the bitumen into fluid, and then pump it up another pipe. This area is the first area to be developed. This is the mined area we've been talking about. This is roughly 100 kilometers to Fort McMurray. So this is a little over 100 down to here, Gregoire Lake and Anzac, and so on. This is what that development will look like when it's fully complete. So they're right, it isn't going to make a mine pit, but there certainly isn't a lot of habitat left for caribou or any other sensitive animals there, something that they've now been told by the Provincial Caribou Committee. So we have more of these developments though planned. There are a couple of mines still to go in. They've now leased 99% of the area that can be reached by surface mines, but there are 3 or 4 mines still to approve. And we have an environmental impact process that's a joke. Usually all of the concerns that are listed are either environmental or social, but somehow the panel is always 3 engineers appointed by the government, the Energy Resources Conservation Board. They've approved 3,000 out of 3,000 applications. So, you know, it might be fun to go in. You hear different stories and different lawyers and different advocates and proponents and opponents. But it's like going to a Wagner opera. You know what's going to happen. You know what the bottom line is after the fat lady sings. So this is our environmental review process. And if you think that foreign governments and the scientists who advise them are stupid enough not to see this, you should be a federal politician. So a few things that need to be done. I mentioned Peter Hodson and the studies that he had going on toxicity. They're mostly of embryonic toxicity, and as many of you probably know, the most sensitive stage of any fish or mammal or vertebrate, probably invertebrates too, is usually the embryonic or larval stage. So they studied fish larvae hatched from eggs that were developing on these bitumen-contaminated sediments. And it was kind of peculiar because in each of the papers they list the sorts of deformities that they saw. Firstly, they found that 90 to 95% of the eggs didn't hatch or the embryos died right after. But of the survivors, there were these peculiar deformities, and they didn't study what happened to them. Well, Native people have been complaining since the early 90s about deformed and malformed fish in the area, as have 2 Western scientists, one who works for Fisheries and Oceans and the other who's a private consultant, both of whom have worked in the Delta area since the mid-1970s. So we put in a freezer at Fort Chip and some forms up there. And taught the nursing station person to fill out the forms so that we could record where people caught these fish. And in 1 year, this is what we got. This is a lake whitefish that was taken in the area. Nice big tumor on it. Here's another one with a deformed spine. Here's a pike with 2 tails. Another whitefish with lots of big hematomas on them. Mouth and eye deformities were recorded in some of their studies. Here's an adult with these. Here's another tumor, this time on a burbot. And here's a super walleye. Only one eye is this size, but bet this guy can see really well at night, at least out of one side of his head. These were all the sorts of things that were recorded in the embryos. And the people say they only get these deformities when the fish are coming down the river. If they're coming off the lake, they don't get them. So my guess is these are just these deformed embryos growing up. They're probably low in contaminants because these fish do most of their growing in the lake, not in the river. But would you buy these at Safeway? So it probably doesn't matter if they're contaminated. People up there don't eat them. Some of them won't even feed them to their dogs. So the subsistence living that we guaranteed those people with Treaty 8 is pretty well gone. Reclamation is another issue. This is what the area looks like from the air. This is what my wife, who took this photo, would call a wooded fen. And she actually works on reclamation for a couple of the oil sands companies. This is what it looks like on the ground. She and her students have recorded 300 species in these wooded fens of plants and animals. When they're done with this and put it back, this is the example they're proudest of. If you want to see a funny YouTube that is very popular in our botany department, look up one by Patrick Moore a few weeks ago touring Syncrude's Gateway project. He says what a wonderful reclamation this is, that this was once a mine. Well, it wasn't a mine. This was clean overburden that was pushed off where they put the mine. So some of the salinity and pollution problems don't occur in this. He points to a little yellow flower, and to tell how beautiful it was, this yellow flower happens to be an exotic, and it's noted for being high in cyanide. So needless to say, this is a very popular video in botany classes, but not for reasons that the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers would think. I'll come back to this in a minute on costs. This is an actual reclaimed forest in the area. And this is the best sort of wetland they can get after 20 years of trying. This has 17 species in it rather than 300. And the study that we just published last week, 7 years of 2010 emissions of carbon would be worth $2.5 billion as carbon storage and natural capital at the sort of going rate for carbon storage going these days. They show you the success stories. They don't show you photos like this of huge gully erosion running through these. These sediments, when they're done, are kind of like jello. They're clay, and there's a lot of water in them, and they're very unstable. And here you have a bunch of engineers scratching their heads about how to improve this. They're putting in big blocks of peat, and they have things on TV showing you these blocks of peat, and they're nice and green now. But it's well known that those peat plants don't tolerate high salinity. This is about 100 units, and that's the average for peatlands in the area. You can get the best of the oil sands disturbed land is up here at about 1,000 in conductivity, and their pits are up about here. You could put in saline wetlands like you'd find around marine systems or closed basins lake in Saskatchewan, but that's not what they're trying to put in. They're trying to reconstruct ecosystems that will only tolerate this salinity in systems that have this for salinity. So needless to say, they're going to fail. And on TV, you'll hear time after time how they're going to put it back just the way it was. Well, this is a map from our paper that just came out. The gray and brown areas here are the peat and the wooded peat areas that you saw in that photo. This is what they'll put back. The only wetlands will be these long, narrow things like that close-up that I showed you of that reclaimed wetland. The rest will all be upland, and there will be a little bit of riparian around this end pit lake. These end pit lakes are another disgusting thing. What they're allowed to do is to fill the last mine pit half full of tailings and then pump 10 meters of water over the top of it from the Athabasca River and declare it a lake. And as replacement fish habitat, and our Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans has gone along with this 27 times. The first one was approved 17 years ago. There's still no sign that it will support any kind of life, let alone fish. So why do we keep rubber stamping these things without any proof? So altogether, the white area are some of the areas here that I've showed you that they're trying to reclaim. The gray part of this graph, which as you can see is exponential, they're not touching at this point. The amount of money they're putting aside is about 10% of what it costs to put in that gateway buffalo paddock that I showed you on that slide. And that's recognized as an easy site. Guess who's going to pay the reclamation difference? If you're under 40, keep your hand on your wallet. They're coming for you in about 30 years. And as a result of what's going on in those wetlands, lo and behold, this assessment by Environment Canada, not some wild-eyed green group, all of the caribou populations in Alberta are essentially declared uncoverable. And our dear Minister of Environment, when he visited Alberta a few weeks ago, just waved that away, said, well, when the oil sands are reclaimed, we'll stock them from somewhere else in Canada. His excuse for not putting them on the species at risk was we have lots of caribou in Canada. It doesn't matter if we're missing a few populations in Alberta. So, thank you. And there's a film that played on CBC a couple of years ago called Tipping Point, which you can still get up on their website. It gives more of the Aboriginal viewpoint of what's gone on in the area that's kind of interesting to watch. And I'll be happy to try and answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, David. You have the instructions regarding the use of the microphones, if you would follow that fairly carefully, and I would ask that you actually direct your questions very specifically in question form as opposed to actual commentary. Our time is somewhat limited. Dr. Schindler has to lecture again tomorrow. We're conscious of that, so I'll try to keep track of those who would like to address questions. Who would like to begin? John.
John Fraser, former fisheries minister, and now probably in a lot of trouble with some of my old colleagues because I've said what I think about the proposed amendments to the Fisheries Act. But my question, David, is this. I've known Patrick Moore for many years, and nothing he said surprises me. It doesn't even surprise him anymore, so there's not much use trying to persuade him. But I have watched some of this stuff on TV where you have a very attractive young lady who shows you trees and reclaimed ponds, and the indication is, the whole suggestion is that when the mine is through or when the production area is through, everything is going to be just beautiful, as you pointed out. But what appalls me as a Canadian is where in the name of all that's holy is the media of this country? I mean, where are they? And I don't know whether you can give us any advice, but my question, I guess, specifically is it's all very well for conservationists to gather like we are tonight and in other places. But if you don't get it on television And if you don't get the media talking about it, you're wasting your time. And there's another thing it's no good also either just gathering together and condemning the government. This government's going to be there for quite a while, and other governments have been there before it. But if we don't get this stuff out on the media where people can see it and understand it, the task of fixing this is just going to be even much greater than it is. And the second question is, why are there no members of Parliament or members of the Legislative Assembly in this meeting here tonight, and were any of them invited? Thank you.
I agree 100% with you on the media. I also know some of the problems they face, though, in that I think it's true to say that all of our national newspapers pretty well have a bias against saying anything bad about these oil sands. So the few reporters who dare to speak out write for things like Tyee, and industry spends a lot of money savaging those people as well. So, if you need to put bread on the table, and some people I know are worried about their wives and kids with all of this stuff going on, even if they didn't mind being excoriated personally, it's a pretty inhospitable environment in this country. We really have a press that's nowhere near central, and what incenses me even more than that is the picture we're getting from all of this greenwash is no basis for running a democracy. Rule number one, people have to be informed, not brainwashed, to make informed decisions about their government, and not only who they vote for, but telling their governments in no uncertain terms how they want them to behave.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Paula Barrios with SHARE, an organization here in Vancouver. This is more of a technical question. I'm just wondering, what's your take on some of the technologies that companies said are successful they have developed to reclaim tailings, specifically Suncor's TRO technology?
Some of the companies, I think, would actually do better if the governments would just level the playing field. For example, one company that I won't mention by name actually advertised before their hearings that they were going to reclaim as fast as they mined. And then they got approval, and they looked around, and nobody else is reclaiming. So it's a detriment to them, puts them at a financial disadvantage. So they didn't reclaim either. And I do talk to company scientists. Some of them are literally tearing their hair. For example, on this monitoring thing, I had one chief scientist for a company saying, we don't know what to do. We're told that ramp isn't good enough, but we're given no direction. They keep talking that they're coming to us to ask us to pay for part of this, but no one has actually approached us. We don't know who's going to run this thing yet. They've been told that it should be independent, but we're not told who's running it. What are we supposed to do? So I think some of the company people are just about as frustrated as the scientists are.
2 points. One, I noticed that some of the slides said the tar sands, and you use oil sands. I'm wondering why you don't use what it really is tar sands. And the second observation is that is there any way to mine this stuff, without the damage caused? I don't think all the monitoring in the world is going to do much good, because they make those ponds, and they're just ultimately going to get into the watershed, into the streams, and I think we should really just stop it and start to close it down.
Yeah, there are a number of groups that would like to see that done. I think if they were pressed a little bit, they could produce tailings that would be dry. There are a number of engineers in our university who say they could do it now. I'm not sure dry tailings are going to be any better. And typical mines put out all kinds of dry tailings, and when the sulfide ores in them get exposed to oxygen, we end up with acid mine runoff. But it'd be worth, I think, approving a couple to see if they can do better. I'd certainly slow down. I don't know if I'd shut them down. It was, they were in the 70s and 80s developing at a fairly reasonable pace, not this out of control pace that we see. As far as referring to them, I tend to use the terms interchangeably. I know what they look like. They're hard in the wintertime, and it gets on your shoes in the summertime. And there's a few politicians that I'd like to oil and feather using oil sans oil. But they're politically loaded terms, and it's common sense to me, so I don't care which one I use.
Do you think protests and marches are an effective part of making change, given the militarization of our local police?
I've never been in one, and I haven't been impressed with the results I've seen. I think they are in the States where they get hundreds of thousands of people. I think if you get a few hundred people out, they're not very effective.
Yeah, can you give a bit of a perspective on, so the new monitoring system that's been announced, what kind of timelines are we talking about till some results are produced, actually, to give you something definitive?
Well, Environment Canada has silently been in the field last year, and they're in the field as we speak. Nobody hears about it. The official monitoring program has not been announced. They haven't made public any of their results. I've seen their mercury results for last year. They were a little bit higher than we found, even for what was coming out of those stacks into the snow. We probably won't hear about it if these scientists continue to be muzzled, unless we get an independent panel so that somebody will hear the results who's not constrained. But I think the monitoring is going on. Now, I expect tomorrow we're going to hear cuts to environmental departments. They're usually the first ones to get cuts. I was on the Minister of Environment, the Deputy Minister of Environment's advisory panel for 3 years at the beginning of this decade, and already they had effectively had a 50% cut at that time. He was quite upset about it and planned to make a Treasury Board submission to get more money, but it was 2001. We all know where all the money went in 2001, and as a result of knowing that, every time I get patted down at the airport, I get angry. It's ridiculous. It's always the last thing. How can we have development going up at 7.5% a year, and the departments that are supposed to keep tabs on it are always getting cuts? It just doesn't. They should be in lockstep. If you're going to have industrial increase, the ability to monitor it and mitigate it, or recommend mitigation schemes, ought to increase in proportion. That hasn't happened in this country in a long time.
Hi, Stan Probosh. I'm a fisheries biologist here in BC. Thanks for that talk. That was great. Just wondering if you have any perspectives on the panel review process that's occurring now with regards to the proposed Enbridge pipeline, and whether it's, in your perspective, objective, how science will be evaluated in that process, and any takes on that, or you're participating in that?
I'm not. This is the one taking place in the U.S. to reroute, if necessary, to go around the Ogallala Aquifer?
No, I'm talking about the one in British Columbia.
The Northern Gateway.
Yeah.
I haven't had any thing to do with that. I know the area that it goes through fairly well because I fish there. There are hundreds of fish-bearing streams they'll have to cross. If they remove the habitat provisions from the Fisheries Act, the way it's being rumored, I think it'll be open season on those fisheries. I was a fisheries scientist with DFO for 22 years. My daughter was a scientist with them for about 8 years, specifically to help design road crossings and things like that. And I know full well what can go wrong with those things if they're poorly designed. And these are important things that they do. They shouldn't be taken lightly. The examples that they hold up of a flooded field being declared fish habitat, those are real exceptions to the rule. You shouldn't be throwing out major stream crossings and pipelines going down rivers the size and importance of the Kitimat because of those. It's really like throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
I have two questions here first.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I was wondering, when you were looking at the environmental impacts of the tar sands in your very interesting research, how does that compare to a more traditional type of oil mining procedure? Like, I know that they're labeling it as being more ethical oil, but is it? I know that it's worth it environmentally, but what kind of differences do you see?
I haven't done much study around conventional oil. I've seen some examples of major blowouts and things. There's a number. I live right in the heart of oil country, and there's an occasional farm that just disappears because they get a blowout they can't control, and they simply buy the farmer a new farm, and he moves away. They had one with a sour gas known as the lodgepole blowout about 5 years before I moved there. I live 50 kilometers from Lodgepole, and it peeled the paint off the buildings in the nearest town that I live in, which is 5 kilometers away, or 45 kilometers from that blowout. That's the blowout that was the origin of the Pembina Institute. So there are some pretty big things that are going on, but nothing on this scale. I think the only development I've seen that's comparable is the mountaintop mining for coal that's happening in the U.S. Southeast, where they are leveling mountaintops and pushing them into stream valleys and causing pretty comparable damage.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could comment on the Kalamazoo spill, the Enbridge spill, which was diluted bitumen, or dilbit as they call it, because it's far more corrosive than normal oil, normal crude oil, conventional crude oil. And they're still trying to clean up the river. It's still closed after that 1 million-gallon spill in July 10. And apparently it's cost 10 times as much as it would do for conventional oil. It's much more corrosive, et cetera, et cetera. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know much in detail about it. The two spills that I've had some dealing with are the one at Wabamun, where they're still having tar balls floating up 7 years later. At least they now allow people to catch the fish again. I think there's still a consumption advisory on them, though. And the Exxon Valdez, where, as I mentioned, there's still damage to sea otter populations and sea ducks. Plus, if you walk that beach anywhere within 50 kilometers, it's still coated with a ring of tar. My daughter lives right in that area at Homer, Alaska, so visit there every few years, and you can still see that damage. So there is some damage that's permanent. Most of the toxic damage gets over with pretty quickly. Luckily, most of the really toxic things are also volatile, so they disappear to the atmosphere. The oiling of ducks and these oils that seep into the sediments and carry some of the contaminants with them and then are pulled back up by bottom-eating organisms like sea otters feeding on mollusks and things are the things that see the long-term effects. But it seems funny to me. I live right in the hard oil country. Most of my neighbors are pipeline welders and things like that. There's been lots of oil spills. I have people phoning me up in the middle of the night, and have for years, saying, you ought to see what's happening down here. You know, I don't let anybody know I told you this, but they've got a bunch of trucks down there at night, and they're scooping up this bog because it's all full of oil. And they're carting it off somewhere, probably to the Swan Hills. Just that it's become visible in the last year or so. It's been going on for a long time.
David, we have a question over here. Your mic on?
Is that on? Is that on? Okay, good. Thank you, Dr. Schindler. It's always very, very interesting, also educational to listen to your talk. This is my, I heard you about almost 10 years ago when you came here to speak on that. But before I ask a question and my comment, I want to acknowledge and give my thanks to Mr. John Fraser. I salute you, sir, for having the courage to come out to denounce your conservative friends. And so I salute you, Mr. John Fraser.
Yeah, I would second that. When I was a member of Fisheries and Oceans, there was a period that John was either the Minister of Fisheries or Speaker of the House. And there were a few years we wouldn't have had an acid rain program if it hadn't been for him.
Maybe you're the only good conservative in our generation. Anyway.
It's what the word used to mean.
Yes, today,
perhaps
earlier today.
Could I just respond?
Yes.
And you can pass this on. In my view, a true conservative must be a conservationist.
Yep.
And these people who call themselves conservatives, who are not conservationists, are just right-wing ideologues who, as I said in public, have very little understanding, intelligence, or wisdom.
Thank you.
So back to the question.
Okay, my question is that because the title of your talk is very philosophical, and I'm not a natural scientist student. I'm in the sociology and philosophy, so I'm going to pose my question in that form. I think that we talk about the economics of the tar sands. I think this should be more the political economy of the tar sands. In other words, who benefits from this, the exploitation of this resources and who suffers. And earlier today, there was an item in CBC, that's true, and it's talk about a First Nation person from, I think it's from the Lakehead area, and employed at Fort McMurray. And just for a few years, he has to quit and went back, and that was the story. And he was saying that as a member of the First Nation people, he experienced, like some other, experienced very strong racism at the worksite. So it doesn't surprise me. So even if some national, in fact, he used the term is that at the worksite, all those WASP, that means that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, really is that treating him in a very, very demeaning and colonial ways. So I think that, but that's aside. Some of us will know what the Greek mythology is, the King Midas, who got the touch of gold. Tell me, I just want to question is that, in your opinion, do you think that this tar sand is really that goal of King Midas? That although that it might appear to be benefiting us some, but ultimately it is actually causing us greater.
I think when all the bills are paid for reclamation, we'll have lost money on the oil sands. As a matter of fact, given where the profits are going, I'm sure of it. As I showed on that Parkland Institute graph, most of it's going to the companies. Most of those companies are multinationals that don't even have headquarters in Canada. They have a satellite in Calgary to run the oil sands, and that's it. Those reclamations are not going to be done by companies. You can see that clearly. Remember, this is mining. There have been several Auditor General's reports on mining. I've participated in a couple of them. The Canadian tradition is when you stop making money, you strip all of the equipment that's worth anything and scram. We have a good example in the giant mine in Yellowknife sitting there right now. And there are several others that taxpayers are paying a couple of $1 billion a year just to pump the pollutants that are seeping from the mines back over the top of the dike. We're not doing any real reclamation. That's what mining is like in this country, and we need to change that tradition.
Yeah, then at the beginning you talk about the Sydney tar pond, which that was, for people in my generation with the dinosaurs will know that how costly and how expensive it is. Yeah. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Take two more questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm Susan Pincus from Eco-Justice. Dr. Schindler, you've had incredible success over the years at designing research that changes public policy, and I'm wondering if you would share any of the wisdom that you've gained in what are the hallmarks, like how do you think about designing research that's really going to hit that target and communicating it?
Well, I think, the story I went through on why we did the oil sands study is pretty common. And I've actually been accused in the last year of inventing that story. I had this reporter say, somehow when you do a study, you always find pollutants. How come? Well, it's if you've got a nose for problems, you know what the toxic contaminants are. You see black snow, you know what the history of other places are. Seeing a stack sitting there with, well, it's like a doctor. I don't think there are many medical doctors who believe in immaculate conception, and to believe that the tar sands were not putting out any pollutants was the ecological equivalent. So if you know what to look for, and you know where to look, it's pretty easy. As I told one reporter, they said, were you surprised by what you found? I said, no, I knew that we'd find something. You did? It's like I'd invented the data and we just did this study and then released the fudge data or something. It's, after 50 years, you can spot pretty clearly where you ought to go to see the hot spots of what's happening.
Last question.
Dr. Schindler, I was wondering, you were talking about the reclamation of the land, and obviously from the pictures, they were pretty pathetic and feeble attempts. I was wondering, is that just a matter of, is it actually physically not possible to reclaim the land properly, or is it just a matter of putting more money into it?
I think it's a matter of not being able to reclaim it, because once they mine those things, the salinity is so high that a lot of plants won't grow. But we have analogous problems on coal mined land and so on. We have a big coal mining pit that I drive by every day right at Wabamun in central Alberta. At least coal mines don't pretend they're going to put it back the way they are. They say, this is what we can do of these three choices. Which one do you want us to do? And when they get some input, they get on with it. And that's what we need to do in the oil sands. Stop pretending that we're going to put peatlands back. Tell people that we can't put back something that can support caribou here. And if people say, well, then it's enough, that's tough. You got to live with that. But what I object to is this greenwashing. Oh, you just wait long enough and we'll put it just back the way it was. Meanwhile, we can't reclaim anything because we have to do more studies. Yes.
Thank you for your questions, and I can't think of a better person, in fact, to comment on the oil sands, given David's past history, the thoroughness of his research, the evidence-based nature of his research, and how he's able to take this into the public realm. Again, this evening, we've seen another example of the success that David has had. These may be small successes, but nevertheless successes, and we hope you will continue in this quest for truth, which obviously has become a bit of a casualty over the last 10 or 20 years in terms of finding out what the true story is. So by the attendance and the nature of the questions here tonight, David, I think we can call this a great success, and we thank you very much.